let's take it away.
Thanks to the track chair for that intro. I'm Stefanie Hetke, Senior Experience Researcher at Adobe.
And I'm Laura Herman, also an Experience Researcher at Adobe.
We'll be sharing insights drawn from our academic backgrounds in neuropsychology and XR user research and industry to inform a multi-sensory approach for designing for spatial computing. Let's start by situating the problem. In 1962, human-computer interaction pioneer Douglas Engelbart put forth the phrase augmenting human intellect, proposing a new integrated approach to pair technology and human needs to help us solve complex problems. His team's work would later yield innovations like the computer mouse and precursors to graphical user interfaces, or GUIs. Though these were groundbreaking developments, they also marked the start of a two-dimensional representation of a three-dimensional world to help us problem solve. However, this paradigm is starting to shift. Spatial computing technologies are on the rise. For example, as of July 2019, there were an estimated 334 million monthly active users of AR, with that number to surpass 1 billion by 2023. Now, it's worth pausing to define how we are using the phrase spatial computing today. Human interaction with a machine, in which the machine retains and manipulates reference to real objects in spaces. That is, this technology is perceiving and reacting based on its environment. We're seeing more and more examples of this. Mainstream devices like smartphones and tablets are increasingly equipped with powerful perception capabilities, like the iPad Pro's LiDAR scanner, to provide a 3D representation of a 3D world. Furthermore, in the past 2 years, we've seen the release of MR headsets like the HoloLens 2 and standalone VR headsets like Oculus Quest. This rapid shift towards spatial computing means that one needs to design for systems that increasingly resemble and interact with the inherently multi-sensory human perceptual system via a deeply human-centered approach. However, to our knowledge, there are currently no best practices of multi-sensory design for spatial computing, despite technological development speeding ahead. Our Adobe colleague, Silke Meisnix, has also spoken about this challenge. Today, we're offering lenses from neuropsychology and user research to address this need for best practices.
So in today's presentation, we hope to demonstrate that spatial computing designers would benefit from having an understanding of multisensory perception. Of course, we also recognize the importance of incorporating findings from user experience research with those who interact with and create spatial computing environments. So our objective will be to identify novel common threads between multisensory perception literature and our primary UX research on the experience of spatial computing. We'll use these common threads to inform a new perceptually based approach for designing for spatial computing. And once we propose this new approach, we'll also offer an actionable set of best practices for spatial computing design. But first, let's talk about why it's important to take a multisensory rather than a unisensory approach. Countless neuropsychology studies have demonstrated the strength and efficacy of multisensory design. In one study, for example, participants learned better when they participated in a multisensory experience as compared with a unisensory one. In addition to multisensory experiences being overall more effective, multisensory design can also offer a hack of sorts for designers hoping to evoke a certain experience for their end user. From neuropsychology, we know that there are many multisensory illusions, some of which we'll dig into in a little bit, that can effectively trick the brain to create rich perceptual experiences, even when there is no physical or real component. It's also important for designers to understand multisensory perception because humans are incredibly perceptive of poorly executed multisensory experiences, especially when they involve a mismatch between two or more senses. For this reason, users will immediately be repelled by multisensory design gone wrong. The uncanny valley effect, with which most of us are likely familiar, is a great example of this. When we witness the uncanny valley, human-like avatars make us feel uneasy, and this is caused by a perceptual mismatch between multiple sensory cues. For example, artificial eyes on an otherwise real human face. Clearly, we have much to learn from neuroscience and psychology to inform how we design for multisensory spatial computing experiences.
We'll now share foundational insights from perceptual neuropsychology, drawing from our backgrounds in this field. For example, a general principle in multisensory perception is the assumption of unity. That is, As information from different modalities, like vision or hearing, share more properties, the brain is more likely to treat them as originating from a common object or source. For instance, when we perceive sound to come from the same direction as a visual, the visual experience is deemed more credible by the perceiver. The assumption of unity is highly relevant in the spatial computing context for creating presence, that subjective sensation of being in a real place. Let's walk through this image. So coherence here can loosely be defined as following a consistent mental model. This is related to the assumption of unity. You can think of it as the physics of your scene or experience making sense. Fidelity can be defined here as your resolution. For example, low fidelity might be an 8-bit video game. So if you have high levels of coherence and fidelity, chances are you'll have an experience that is high in presence. However, if coherence is low, but fidelity is high, say you don't have that consistent mental model, however, you have really photoreal content, presence is typically low. However, if you do have that consistent mental model, high levels of coherence, but low fidelity, like that 8-bit video game, you can still achieve a reasonably high sense of presence. So, if an experienced designer had to choose between coherence of sensory stimuli versus fidelity of those same stimuli, coherence is more important to create a sense of presence. And check out Richard Skarbez's Voices of VR podcast for more on this work.
And as we're designing spatial computing environments, it's also important to understand how different senses can interact to cause unique percepts, some of those illusions I mentioned earlier. A great example of this is the rubber hand illusion. In this illusion, the viewer's hand is completely hidden, and they are instead shown a rubber hand, which of course they know very well is not their hand. Then a researcher might touch the person's real hand and their rubber hand at the same time and in the same place. Upon witnessing this combined visual and tactile stimulus, again, despite knowing very well that the rubber hand is not actually their hand, the person will begin to feel as if the rubber hand is their own. Soon enough, the researcher can touch the rubber hand and elicit a sensory motor response from the person without even touching their real hand. Now, some recent studies have experimented with a virtual hand illusion, which brings the concept of the rubber hand illusion into the virtual realm, such as in virtual reality. And sure enough, after only a few minutes of combined visual and sensory input, users begin to adopt the virtual hand as their own, and they experience sensations of touch according to what they see happening to their virtual hand. In this way, we can leverage the human brain to create multisensory spatial design experiences. So now that we've discussed a bit about the cognitive neuropsychology perspective, let's dive into some of our findings from our user research practice and industry. So in our work at Adobe, Stefanie and I have explored several applications of spatial computing. And for each application, we've been tasked with unpacking the user experience. In one study, which we published at Creativity and Cognition last year, we were studying a prototype of a VR tool made by Adobe Research called Canvox, a name drawn from the idea of a canvas on which one could paint with voxels or 3D pixels. Using a prototype of Canvox, we examined whether 2D artists, like painters, expertise would transfer over to a 3D environment should the tool remain the same. In this case, they were still using a paintbrush. However, rather than fitting into a mental model of painting, the users found the tool to be far more reminiscent of sculpting, which is a truly three-dimensional practice. So this study taught us that we should be careful not to assume the transference of skills between standard audiovisual interfaces and spatial computing environments. In this case, being in VR significantly altered the process and the output of the users, and was more closely related to 3D real-world experiences than to 2D ones.
I'll talk about another study that I ran with fellow researcher Rebecca Gordon and designer Eric Natske on a multi-platform drawing tool prototype, a VR headset with a corresponding AR mode on iPad. This was called Project DALI, coming out of Adobe Research. When creative professionals were tasked with drawing and manipulating the depth of letters in real-world space, so like rotation and occlusion, they found spatial manipulation easier in VR relative to using the iPad. Across both of these studies, users with basic proficiency in 3D design tools found the most value in the VR tools, citing opportunities to demonstrate their spatial outputs at real-world scale and get on the same spatial page as their collaborators and stakeholders. For example, one prominent use case articulated by our users included communicating environmental layout of context.
So let's dive a bit more into these certain use cases that VR is particularly well suited for. In one study, we performed an extensive meta-analysis to determine VR's most sought-after use cases within the realm of design. We looked at both categories of design as use cases, as well as processes of design as use cases. So for example, architecture, art direction, and fashion design were some of the relevant categorical use cases that we identified. Within the process realm, we saw the benefits of VR for prototyping, for client presentations, and for scene layout. The commonality between all of the resulting VR use cases was that they each leveraged the uniquely multisensory nature of VR, mimicking real-world sensory environments. So scene layout, for example, harnesses proprioception and vision to produce a multisensory experience that invokes reality.
In our research, we've also observed how user expectations, particularly in AR, align with human perception of the real world, rather than interactions we've come to expect on 2D screens. Across multiple user studies on Adobe Aero, a application, we've observed that users quickly ascribe real-world properties to digital objects. For example, if the user sets an interaction to on-tap, then animate, as we see here on this owl, they might try to actually tap the digital object in reference to where it's placed in the real world. That is in front of the phone, like we just saw, rather than where it actually appears on the screen. This behavior also hints at the expectation to engage with depth cues as we do in daily life. We've also seen that users expect for objects to be pinned to a surface, even if that surface is a white wall. When their content floats away due to a tracking issue, it's not clear to the user why this is happening. These moments of mismatch between the real and the virtual world are an opportunity to provide feedback to the user to let them know that this isn't their fault. We've also observed that this two-finger gesture rotation on a mobile device that we see here is loved by users. This appears to be due to this kinesthetic gesture simulating how we typically rotate a real-world object, but represented on a 2D screen. Now, considering what we know from neuropsychology and our UX research findings, we propose a multisensory design approach and principles for spatial computing. We found evidence to support that working three-dimensionally in a 3D space, that is, afforded by spatial computing technology, is a distinct experience as compared to the three cases on the left. 2D for 2D being classic GUIs, 2D for 3D being using 2D screens for designing in 3D, 3D for 2D, in this case, being using a 2D interface like a video player in a VR headset. Now, we propose a new perceptual design approach for spatial computing that accounts for spatial embodiment. Implications of this approach are that we no longer require visual metaphors like we use in 2D GUIs, as we can now begin to design in a way that accounts for spatial embodiment, that is, movement in Z-space. This approach would become the spatial computing equivalent to the accepted design patterns for 2D screen design. We've also learned that by considering the unique benefits to spatial perception afforded by XR, we can begin to build predictive models of spatial computing use cases. For example, VR is well suited for conveying spatial concepts to stakeholders in a common shared virtual environment, as we've talked about in our past studies.
So with this perceptual design approach, we'd like to propose an actionable set of best practices for spatial computing for you all to use in your work. So as a starting point, we'll give some examples. So first, let's aim for coherence. If you're using both sounds and visuals in a spatial computing environment, make sure that the sound is well paired with the visuals in order to elicit maximum presence. Also, provide feedback whenever the reality of the spatial computing environment does not meet the user's expectation of real reality. Remember Stefanie's earlier example of the AR tracking problem for white walls and offer users feedback at that point. Lastly, try to utilize or adapt gestures that we use in the real world whenever possible. For example, the pinching and turning gesture for rotation is consistent between the real world and between spatial computing environments. We'd be happy to provide some more examples, so let's open it up to questions.
All right, thank you so much, Stefanie and Laura, for that awesome presentation. Looks like you've been answering questions in the Q&A already.
Yes.
I think people are really curious as to the definitions of presence and coherence and what they actually mean from a not just a neuroscience perspective, but how it can be put into use.
Sure. Yeah, so the definition of presence there is that subjective sense of being there, and yes, that's the definition that you see across a lot of literature. I think some folks mentioned works coming out of Jeremy Valencin's lab, and absolutely, that's one great place to look. In terms of coherence, you can think of that as, I like to refer to like the physics of a scene making sense, if you will, or everything having a consistent mental model. And the other thing I also noted to request for the paper is, as soon as the Q&A is over, I'll put together a list and post them there. And also folks are welcome to send me a note to hetka@adobe.com, and I can also share that with you too.
Very cool. I don't know if we have much time for more questions, but I guess I'll just ask a different one. Do you think designing in VR, because of the spatial context, would somehow improve the designs that users create for mixed reality and XR?
That's a great question. I think actually they would just be essentially different at its core. So I think something that we've seen through our research on designing in VR and for VR is that when people are in this alternate sort of reality that is not quite the same multisensory experience as designing in the real world, nor is it the same experience as designing on a 2D screen, the results are different based on the affordances that are available to the user. So I guess the answer is that it's not necessarily better or worse, or at least we don't have metrics to evaluate that at this point, but essentially it would be different and afford a unique experience that might not be produced otherwise.
See. All right. I guess we have to move on to the next talk, but where can people find your research or contact you?
Sure. On my end, feel free to drop me a line at my email. Again, that's Hutka, Hutka, @adobe.com. I also have my my website, which is stephaniehutka.com, where you can, all of my papers and collaborations, some of which are with Laura, are listed there.
Awesome. And for me, my email is lherman@adobe.com, and my website is lauramherman.work. Looking forward to hearing from you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Laura and Stephanie.
Thank you.
All right.